Holla ballers! Welcome to this week's advanced guide looking at the Destruction Warlock in patch 4.3. I know Mr. Pandaria is coming, but people are still pushing to really excel themselves in this expansion. And today we're going to look at the Destruction Warlock and how you can really push yourself towards the top end DPS. The Destruction Warlock has been in a weird place since around the end of TBC, mid-TBC, when they started to feel a hell of a lot like a mage, which was against Blizzard's vision of this vampiric demon summoning caster that was very different to the mage. The Destruction spec has always sort of followed this heavy nuke style where we were using big solid spells, and even in the end of TBC we didn't even use a pet at all. In Cataclysm we do use a pet. Blizzard then enforced the Imp, giving us these Burning Embers buff, allowing us to have instant cast soul fires and all this kind of great stuff, so we could really push ourselves and get back into the routine of using our pets. In Mr. Pandaria, again we're going to be using pets, but again a lesser focus on the vampiric style, where we're going to have mana return to us and all sorts of weird stuff involving our pets, and we will look at that when patch 5.0 lands. The first things I want to talk about on the Destruction Warlock is that we get trapped sometimes into thinking this is actually a relatively simple spec. Out of all the dots, we have Immolate, we have Corruption, we have Bane of Doom. Now, all of those, besides Immolate, the Corruption and the Bane of Doom, actually do very, very little damage. Overall, when we look at our damage meter, we're not going to see a hell of a lot coming from those spells. We also have our Doom Guard to consider, but essentially this is going to boil down to our backdraft and the bane of all things Destruction Warlock, the improved Soulfire buff. Lots of people send me World of Logs reports and all kinds of things like that of them playing Destruction Warlocks, and they're saying, Preacher, why is my DPS so much lower than just generally what I'm looking around for people of similar gear? And it always comes down to this improved Soulfire. Improved Soulfire is a complete pain in the ass, okay? So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how you simplify your goals. Simplify everything you need to do, and that's going to really push your DPS to the max. Because once we simplify, instead of trying to organize 5 or 6 spells and buffs and trinkets and cooldowns that all gets messy in our heads, what we want to do is simplify that stuff down so we can really push ourselves and just let the rest take care of itself naturally, and we don't have to worry about what our end DPS will be because we're looking after the two important things. Improved Soulfire, and why is it a pain in the ass? Improved Soulfire gives you an almost 10% damage buff, okay? It buffs your shadow and your flame damage. Now, the thing is, all our damage is shadow or fire based, so it's just basically a flat 10% buff. It's slightly less, but around a 10% buff to our damage. If you consider it as 10%, you're going to be in happy days. So obviously we need Improved Soulfire up all the damn time, because that buff is immense to all our damage. Every single aspect of our damage is benefiting from improved Soulfire. The problem with improved Soulfire is that Soulfire itself has a ridiculously long travel time. What I'm talking about there is not only does it have a long cast time, but it also travels to the boss before it impacts the boss, and then we have another delay while the game recognises that we have fired off that Soulfire and then gives us the Soulfire buff. In many occasions, it benefits us greatly to be in melee range, not only just for Shadowflame damage, but to reduce the travel time of our improved Soulfire. Improved Soulfire is a buff that really needs to be taken into account almost 6 seconds before it expires. It's not a buff that we can fire off quickly. Again, we've got the cast time, 2.5 seconds, 2.2 depending on your buffs, and we also got the travel time of the spell leaving your Warlock's fingertips and travelling all that way to the boss, and then the game recognising it and feeding that back to our character to get the buff. This is where certain add-ons come into glorious, glorious timing. Power Auras is an add-on that I think is an absolute must for the Destruction Warlock. I have a Power Aura set up to really trivialise this aspect of my gameplay, so that my improved Soulfire should be up throughout the fight around 97 to 99% of the time. And the way I do that is I set up a Soulfire Power Aura that tells me the improved Soulfire debuff is about to run out in 6 seconds. I have 6 seconds left to reactivate the improved Soulfire buff. When I see that Power Aura and I'm casting my spells like I should be, I know that my next spell is going to be a Soulfire. That allows me to build in a 2.5 second cast time, some travel time, and the game registering it, And more often than not, you'll actually see the buff reactivates with about 1 second left to spare. That way we're not wasting casts. We're not trying to fire it off really early. So we've got only half of, 3 or 4 seconds remaining of our improved Soulfire buff, and we're refreshing it very early. Thereby we've probably missed out on an Incinerate or an Immolate or anything like that. Really, really, truly important. A power aura for this will trivialize this entire aspect, therefore simplifying your goals, leaving you nothing to worry about. Just by having a power aura that says, yo, you've got 6 seconds left on your improved Soulfire buff, better go ahead and reactivate that bad boy. Get it casted, get it flying, get it in the air, and therefore you've just buffed your damage by a nice big 10%. Oh, that's glorious. We love it. That is the best thing you can do for it, guys, okay? Really important. Take into account the travel time of Soulfire. If you're not using an add-on like Power Auras, just be aware with about 6 seconds left on that buff, you need to be casting that Soulfire. You want to be casting that Soulfire because that buff is so immense to all our damage. It is imperative we keep this debuff up as much as possible. Really, check your logs afterwards. Check what you're doing. What was my improved Soulfire uptime? It should be about 97 to 99% of the fight had improved Soulfire. When you're starting a fight as a Destruction Warlock, you want to be soul burning a Soulfire and have that in the air before you cast anything. So important that you get this buff up from the very, very beginning of the fight. As soon as you're starting, get that Soulfire in the air. If you've got a nice countdown to a pull, plan it out. Remember, Soulfire has a 2.2 to 2.5 second cast time. Get it in the air. The second that boss is active, your Soulfire should be smashing it in the face. It should be crushing the boss. And you've got your buff up all the time now for your Immolates, your Corruptions, and your Bane of Doom. So, so important. The next one I want to talk about to simplify our goals of these 1 or 2 things, remember the first one is to improve Soulfire, is Conflagrate. Conflagrate will actually generally be the second most damaging spell you cast. And the most important thing about Conflagrate is that it then buffs all your other Incinerates, which is so important as well. What you'll see with a good Warlock is they will have loads more Incinerates casted than anybody else. And their Conflag damage will be really, really high. Why? Because Conflagrate gives us this lovely backdraft debuff. Backdraft means we've got huge haste for our next Incinerates and Chaos Bolt. So, so important, guys, that the more Conflagrates we do, the more Incinerates we do that are faster, and so on and so forth. It all just synergizes really, really well. So we have Backdraft up more, we have more Incinerates casted, we have more Conflagrates casted, which are really hard hitting spells. You're going to see Conflagrates critting for about 60 to 70k in decent gear, and you're going to be firing them off all the time. Again, the best way of doing this, and you'll see this on my UI, is I have a Conflagrate Power Aura. Now this Power Aura doesn't tell me when Conflagrate is off cooldown, because that's too late. I need to know when Conflagrate is about to come off cooldown. So what I do with my Power Aura is to simplify this goal again, to make sure I'm maximizing as many Conflagrates as possible, is my Power Aura activates when there is 1 second remaining on the Conflagrate cooldown. With 1 second remaining, that means that when I'm casting and I see the Conflagrate Power Aura come off, I am likely, nearly 100% of the time, to just spam the Conflagrate button as soon as that cast finishes and it'll go off, giving me nearly maximum Conflagrate uptime. Every single time Conflagrate is available, I am using it to its maximum potential. So important again, guys. And all you'll see here is passively, by doing this Power Aura, by just making sure that we're making best use of Conflagrate, is our Incinerate damage will go through the roof. It will passively go through the roof. You don't need to worry about it anymore. So easy. And from that, we're making the best use of Conflagrate. You'll notice the huge switching damage. An average Destruction Warlock will see not only a reduced uptime improved Soulfire, but generally on their damage recount list, they'll see Incinerate at the top, and then they'll see their Imp as second, and Conflagrate usually third. The ideal situation you want to be in is Incinerate first, Conflagrate second, then your Imp. That's what you want to be looking for when you're checking your damage meter at the end to see which spells did the most damage. Check it out. You should have Incinerate way ahead because we've had a much bigger time on Backdraft. We've had haste up for a lot longer. Therefore, our Incinerate damage has improved dramatically. And because we're using many more Conflagrates, we've also seen the Conflagrate damage go right through the roof. So important, guys. Now, by simply doing these 2 things, by making sure our improved Soulfire is up and we're using as many Conflagrates as possible, guess what? You've just simplified everything and the damage will take care of itself. If you miss 1 or 2 seconds on Corruption, a couple of seconds on Bane of Doom, it barely even matters. Check your recount again, check your SCADA, check how much damage Corruption and Bane of Doom are doing overall. It's so small, it's really little, it's barely even there, it's hardly worth worrying about. Sure, you want to keep these debuffs up, but overall, in the grand scheme of things, keeping our Immolate on, our improved Soulfire and our Conflagrate are always the primary goals of any Destruction Warlock, and making the best use of both of those things is tremendous increase to your DPS. I cannot express it enough. And the rest will just simply take care of itself. Don't worry about hitting Shadowflame every single second. Shadowflame is a minor, at best, DPS upgrade. It's really minor for a Destruction Warlock. Overall, Corruption is minor, and Bane of Doom generally is pretty minor as well. We care about a couple of things. We care about our Immolate. Immolate should be running all the time, and that Immolate should have the improved Soulfire buff on it. We should also be using as many Conflagrates as humanly possible, and we want to make sure our improved Soulfire is up all the damn time. The rest of it, guys, will just fall into place and you'll start doing awesome DPS. I absolutely love this aspect of it. Simplify it down. That's what we're always trying to do. Simplify it. And by doing these two things, you're in Dreamsville. You're in absolute God mode. The last thing I want to talk about with the Destruction Warlock is our AoE. Our AoE is really shit. Okay, we need to accept that fact that a Destruction Warlock's AoE is pretty crap. Now, some of this is actually buffed up by Bane of Havoc. Bane of Havoc transferring some of the damage you do to other targets to that target as well. So when we're going into AoE mode, we need to have Bane of Target, preferably on a target that will live longer than the rest. That way, while we're cleaving and destroying absolutely everything else, the damage we're doing is being transferred in some form to the other target. Remember, Bane of Havoc can even be cheesed on fights like War Master. I forget his name. The gunship in Dragon Soul. As soon as Garryona flies past on the big left-hand side of the boat, we should be putting Bane of Havoc on Garryona, and it will remain on him for the rest of the fight. And while we're DPSing all the drakes and all the guys smashing us in the face, while we're doing all that stuff, part of that damage is constantly being transferred over to Garryona and giving a nice extra DPS that we're just passively doing. We don't even have to worry about it for the remainder of the fight. So important, guys, that you make best use of Bane of Havoc. If you're doing things like Marchok Heroic, get Bane of Havoc on the other target. But also, people forget that you should still put dots on the other target that has Bane of Havoc. Don't ignore it. Don't expect that Bane of Havoc alone is enough to kill that target or do the best amount of damage. If you can get an Immolate on it, and you can get a Corruption on that target as well, you should be doing. Don't ignore it. Bane of Havoc is just an extra source of damage. You still want to be dotting up the other target as well, even the one with Bane of Havoc on it. Just because a lot of the damage is transferred from other targets to the Bane of Havoc target, your damage on that target still counts as well. So when you're doing double dotting and you've got Bane of Havoc on one target, still keep him dotted. Very important. Now, when we have 3+ mobs, we've got 4 mobs and above, we actually start to use Shadowflame a hell of a lot more. Shadowflame really comes into its own. If you're thinking about your Sarge the Unsleeping when all those ads spawn, one of the biggest sources of our AoE damage is going to be Shadowflaming as many targets as possible while still maintaining our improved Soulfire buff. By using these power auras that I talked about earlier, while we're doing massive amounts of AoE damage, we can still keep up our Conflagrates and our improved Soulfire. So important. Remember, Rain of Fire is still a fire spell, so buff that bad boy by 10%. Shadowflame is still shadow damage. Buff that bad boy by another 10%. Get that damage up there. So important. Really keep your improved Soulfire buff up while you're doing AoE DPS. Ideally, get some Soul Burn ready, so while you're doing huge AoE, you can just instantly fire off a quick Soulfire, get the buff back up for the remainder of the AoE, and continue to channel Shadowflame and Rain of Fire. That is our best source of AoE damage, and don't expect to do massive competition with the people who are doing huge amounts of burst AoE damage. It's not going to be possible. We're not going to compete with a mage spreading combustion to 7 or 8 ads. We're just not going to do it. So accept that. Destruction Warlock is very powerful. Very powerful single target nuke, and if we've got 2 mobs, such as Marchok Heroic, where we're fighting Marchok and Korkron, You're going to be in happy, happy days as you're doing passively tons and tons of cleave, okay? So what I want you to take away from this is very, very simple. Simplify the goals. Don't worry about all your buffs and debuffs and keeping your dots on and all that. A Destruction Warlock's bread and butter is Immolate, Improved Soulfight, and Conflagrate. Get those 3 things fixed, and guess what? The rest of the damage will take care of itself, ballers. Absolutely. You enjoy it. Take it easy. Have a great day. Goodbye.